Well, we did say they were coming thick and fast. Welcome to 2025 and welcome to the first EFL Championship Manager Special of the year. And despite the fact it features a club that regularly have manager specials in a championship, it features a man who, for obvious reasons, has rarely featured in this situation. We are, of course, talking about Stoke City, who, after just 3.5 months with Narcis Pelach, have opted to switch to Mark Robins, a tried and trusted man that Coventry City fans will know well, who was appointed as manager, crucially rather than head coach, on a 3.5 year contract. We're going to talk about the new man as always and what we expect for Stoke in the future. But first, as we always do, let's have a quick reflection on the old man, because you'll remember back in September, August, whenever it was now, I was quite critical of the fact that Stoke sacked a manager who had achieved a 40% win rate in Steven Schumacher, something that a lot of good championship managers have gone to Stoke and not been able to do. It has ended up being a bit of a weird merry-go-round where no one can quite get it right. But Steven Schumacher was doing pretty well. They'd started the season okay, and then he bizarrely got sacked, supposedly due to a falling out with John Walters, who I'm sure will feature in this a bit. And then Narcis Pelach was brought in, an unproven coach who was highly thought of from Norwich City. Of course, we watched his first game in charge live here on a Friday night against Hull City, where they collapsed from a 1-0 lead. And again, that's a stat that will feature during this episode. But it was just a disastrous 3 months, wasn't it? We said that we didn't think it was the right time to come in with an unproven manager in a season that was going to be a little bit transitional for Stoke, and it just sort of proved that way. 19 games in charge, only 3 victories, a win rate of under 16%. And to be honest, it was just never going to be enough. You look at his time in charge and it was a disaster from start to finish, really. Again, maybe perhaps a slight over-exaggeration of change of style in one go. I sort of liken it to what we mentioned with Millwall last year, with Birmingham when they went for Wayne Rooney, albeit different circumstances there, trying to change from a style that it was progressing under Steven Schumacher, but he was trying to do it steadily and on a sort of bit-by-bit basis, whereas Narcis Pelach came in and immediately Stoke tried to start playing a different way. And then when it started to go wrong, probably the most worrying thing for him is when it started to go wrong after 6-7 weeks, he then gradually returned to an older way. And in the end, they were getting outplayed by teams who have had horrible seasons like Luton, or by Sheffield Wednesday with 10 men, that final nail in the coffin, where they conceded 2 goals despite being 11 against 10 at 0-0. So for Narcis Pelach, I didn't think it was ever going to work. But of course, he's a young coach. His time will come again. He'll get another opportunity and he'll probably be better for the experience. But Stoke City have been drawn into a relegation battle. And now they've gone to one of the most proven hands in the EFL Championship, but largely at one club. And that man, of course, is Mark Robins. He has been appointed manager of Stoke City on a 3.5 year contract. And it's very rare these days that we see a manager rather than a head coach. Maybe signals what his demands were when he went in for this job interview, given that a head coach had been in before. And with a lot of the criticism on John Walters and the way that he's managed the situation at the club this season, perhaps takes a little bit of pressure off of him by saying Mark Robins is going to be the main man and he's going to make the decisions here, which if you're getting someone of that ilk, you probably should. And we've talked about it a little bit before with Stoke, haven't we? They've gone through these coaches and these managers who have done brilliant jobs elsewhere, and they've always struggled at Stoke. Now, for that to be the common denominator, it's probably not just a poor group of players. We'll liken it to, say, Manchester United in the Premier League. There's going to be something behind the scenes that's causing that. And just the change of word in there makes you think perhaps there will be a difference in approach this time. He'll take charge after today's New Year's Day game, which Ryan Shawcross will manage against Burnley. He himself picked up a great result against Sunderland, didn't he? Which again was a bit of a smash and grab a few days ago. But he comes in with 2 assistants, very well-respected coaches in Paul Nevin and James Rowberry. You'll recognise Rowberry managing in the lower leagues before. It's also been at Cardiff. And Paul Nevin, if you've seen the England dugout before, you will have seen Paul Nevin's face there. But a really good team coming in together. Mark Robins at the helm of it, something that, to be honest, in the many excuses that Jeff King gave for sacking him at Coventry earlier in the season, was one of the things he talked about, the fact that Mark Robins had so much power. But you could argue with that power he made good decisions, because let's go back to his stint at Coventry City, which of course is the main thing Stoke talk about in their statement, the record he's got behind him at the club and the pedigree he's got from his time at Coventry. Well, 2 promotions on his CV, an EFL trophy win at Wembley, 1 kick from the Premier League in that playoff final against Luton, which I was obviously at 18 months or so ago. And then, of course, you've also got last year where they were, well, literally a fingernail or a toenail from the FA Cup final, weren't they, against Manchester United with that ridiculous comeback. So there is no doubting his CV since taking charge of Coventry City. Let's not forget, it wasn't all roses and brilliance throughout his managerial career, but generally speaking, he's done a good job at most clubs. Over a 40% win rate at Rotherham over a couple of years. At Barnsley, he did okay, but it was a time that was difficult for the club. His first stint at Coventry, 51% win rate. At Huddersfield, about 1 in 3. At Scunthorpe, about 1 in 3. He's never had a dramatic failure on his CV, though he has had a couple of poor spells. And that includes at Coventry in that 7.5 year spell where they had a couple of disastrous starts where people were talking about Robins going. There were one season in particular where they were right down the bottom, where they couldn't play loads of home matches. And in the end, they managed to catch up and always found a way. And in fact, when he was sacked on the 7th of November, he'd won 2 of his last 3 matches, including a battering of Middlesbrough, who are now up in the playoff race, and against Luton from 2-0 down where they won 3-2. So just as they were starting to click this season, they let him go. But that is potentially Stoke City's gain. The only concern I do have is that obviously Mark Robins has been entrenched in Coventry City and managing in a certain way for a number of years on a certain budget with a certain type of player. Now, the good news for Stoke City is that generally after slow starts to the season, the football's entertaining, the club scores goals. You cannot question whether he develops players or not on the coaching side as well, because, well, go and look at Victor Gyökeres tearing up Europe, where even Brighton, one of the best recruiting clubs in Europe, let him go, and Coventry were able to take advantage. There are so many examples across, with Gustavo Harmer now doing well at Sheffield United too. And even on this podcast, we've talked to people who have played under Mark Robins, for example, Gail Bigger-Romana at Coventry, who all have positive words to say about him. So there is no doubt that Mark Robins is a popular figure with fans and players at the clubs he manages. And in the last 7 years, he has taken Coventry City on a remarkable rise. And you've got to remember that during that time, there were seasons where they weren't able to play at home. He was succeeding while playing at Northampton and at Birmingham City. He certainly didn't have the easy deck of cards to deal with, and he really made the most of it. To take Coventry City from the bottom end of the EFL up to the playoff final in the Championship is some effort. But we've got to look at the other side with Stoke City, because how do we expect him to get on and what has he got to address? Well, let's be honest, Stoke City are now just 4 points above the relegation zone. They've scored 24 in 24. Goals have been a little bit of a problem for them. Even under Schumacher, I know they had a couple of great days, that win away in the Carabao Cup at the start of the season, but it's not always been consistently free-flowing. You can particularly say that away from home, where Stoke City have scored just 6 of those 24 goals this season. That's something is going to have to be addressed by Robins. And to be fair, at Coventry, his strength was the home form, but potentially at Stoke, he might be backed with a slightly bigger budget. Coventry were always punching above their weight in a Championship with him. And as we've mentioned before, Stoke have signed some exciting attacking players this year. Tom Cannon, who scored that winner against Sunderland, is a very good striker given the service. And with Mark Robins coming in at the start of the January window, you can expect there to be a bit of movement during this window, can't you? I think there'll probably be 2 or 3 additions. I think we might see 1 or 2 in wide areas and attacking positions. If we go and have a look at the other stat that I find most interesting about Stoke this season, though, they have only been trailing at half-time 5 times this season. One of the biggest problems Stoke City have had is conceding second half goals and conceding from positions where they were picking up points. Now, a lot of those, of course, are away from home where they were 0-0 and then fell away in the second half. The perfect example is that game I mentioned, the 2-0 defeat at Sheffield Wednesday, where Sheffield Wednesday went down to 10 just before half-time, and Stoke still managed to concede 2 in the second half to lose 2-0. But overall, that is very clearly an issue that Stoke have got to deal with. Second half goals being conceded, not being able to score many away from home, and throwing away positions where they could pick up points. I mean, you even look a little further up the table. The difference between Stoke in 18th and, say, Preston in 14th or West Brom in 8th even, is that so many of those losses are turned into draws for those 2 clubs. And that makes the difference between 6, 7, 8 positions in a table at times, in a Championship table that this season has become incredibly tight again, particularly at the bottom end of the table. Turning defeats into draws can be almost as valuable as turning draws into victories. Let's have a look, though, at what Mark Robins has got to deal with early in his spell, because in the last couple of manager specials with Oxford and with Millwall, we talked about the fact that the timing was excellent. and it gave managers a chance to succeed early on because they had fixtures that were more friendly or more winnable on paper. And while, yes, Mark Robins is going to have a transfer window to work, he's going to be able to bring in his players and maybe not expect the quickest start in the world. It isn't quite as easy on paper, but it's a real mix because they're playing sides that are right in and around them at the bottom end of the table, and then they're playing some of the big hitters in the league. So I guess you could argue if they can pick up 2 or 3 wins against those bottom sides, they are going to find themselves in a much more comfortable position regardless. So you look, for example, the first game Mark Robins will take charge is at home to Plymouth, which may become a more difficult game now because obviously Wayne Rooney has been let go from his role. I expect that to be the next manager special on the channel. Wonder if it could be Steven Schumacher v Stoke on Saturday. We'll wait and see. Then after that, a tough FA Cup tie. West Brom away is difficult, even though they're managerless at the moment as well. But then Portsmouth away, Oxford at home, Hull away. 3 games in succession there at the end of the month that are crucial to avoid getting sucked into a relegation battle. I mean, Oxford 20th, Hull 21st, Pompey 23rd. You lose those 3, you have to start looking over your shoulder. And a couple would then be overtaken. And it's a kind of important spell as well because you then go into February. There are some really tricky games, albeit potentially some of them could have been more difficult with Watford being away from home against Stoke. If it had been at Vicarage Road, would have been a very different story. But still, an interesting start for Mark Robins and maybe not as friendly on paper as we've seen elsewhere. And particularly with a lot of those games, as I mentioned, like the Portsmouth and the Hull City one being away from home, it is going to be a real test of whether he can change that form during this season. Obviously, the fixture everyone's going to be looking out for is the one on the 8th of March, which is Coventry versus Stoke City. I'm imagining he'll get a ridiculously good reception at Coventry City, but will he be in trouble with Stoke by then? That's going to be the question. We normally ask, are managers going to see out their contracts? And this is probably one of the few that's really hard to call because Stoke City have had so many solid championship managers go there and struggle. Nathan Jones did a brilliant job at Luton, didn't make it at Stoke City. Gary Rowett has done a very good job at several championship clubs, not able to do so at Stoke City. Michael O'Neill did a brilliant job with Northern Ireland, went Stoke City, it went wrong. Alex Neil, very good CV in the championship. We talked about it extensively in that Millwall manager special just yesterday, and then went Stoke City and couldn't quite make it work. And the only man who arguably was Steven Schumacher, but according to the Stoke City board, not enough so. So will Mark Robins be able to buck the trend? Will he be able to be the man that goes in and carries his form from another club into Stoke City? And is he going to be given the time to do so? Because John Walters in this sporting director role seems to be very trigger happy, doesn't seem to be wanting to back his decisions. And if we're to believe what has come out about the Steven Schumacher situation, is perhaps a little power hungry. Now, of course, we don't know how the inside of the club is working from there, but I would assume the fact that Mark Robins has got the manager role, has got his assistants coming in with him, I think that it's going to be Mark Robins in charge and given a chance to work. And why wouldn't you? Because he's proven that when that's the case, he can deliver stability and success to a football club. So I'm intrigued to see how the Stoke City stint goes. Do we think he'll see out 3.5 years? Probably not, because it just isn't generally the way in the Championship. His stint at Coventry was probably an outlier. However, do we think he'll be a success? Well, if given time, yes is the answer. My question's going to be the usual one for Stoke. They'll get to the end of this season. They'll stay up, in my opinion. Then the start of next year, they will probably start slowly. Mark Robins has a history of that at every club. Will they stick with him and wait for the success to come? Or will they do the usual pulling of the trigger in August, September, October and be one of the first manager specials of the year again? Because we're very used to that with Stoke, aren't we? It doesn't really matter what I think, though. Stoke City fans, are you happy with Mark Robins? Other Championship fans, do you think it's the right decision from Stoke? And do you think Mark Robins will be the man to finally succeed in a role? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. You can see our full New Year's Day fixture predictions for the Championship up in the eye above. And we will be back tomorrow to look ahead to the weekend fixture list as well. So come and get involved in the prediction show if you haven't before. If you did enjoy this little look at Stoke City and the managerial change there, then please do put a thumbs up on the video. Subscribe for regular content. We will have some normal lighting back in the next couple of episodes. But for now, thank you very much for watching. And we'll see you again tomorrow to look ahead to another Championship match week.